What's the most disturbing thing you've heard a dying person say? My mom was in the late stages of dementia and had stopped eating. Her medical directive would not allow a feeding tube to be installed, so we were just kind of waiting around for her to die. She didn't recognize anyone and hadn't spoken at all for about 2 months. I was sitting with her, stroking her hand and talking to her while she was in and out of consciousness. She squeezed my hand, opened her eyes, and said, "Oh, my baby, my darling girl, and then my name. "Everything is so beautiful, you don't need to worry. I love you, my girl," and fell back into unconsciousness. She died about 20 minutes later. I love you, Mama. She wasn't the best mom, but she was my mom, and we'd made our peace long before she died. She died 6 years ago on May 25th. I know it's not disturbing, really, but it kind of was, because we all totally thought she was gone, and it was a bit of a shock. Next story. My cousin was dating a girl named Sarah, and as my mom was dying, she said,
"Just remember, Sarah did it."
and then said,
"Don't trust that girl. Mark my words, Sarah did it."
It's been 20 years. My cousin married her and they had 2 kids. She's an extremely lovely woman. The 2 kids turned out amazing. My cousin is still very happy. Sometimes my siblings and I look at each other and say, "Sarah did it." We don't have the heart to tell them my mom said that, so they can never know this. It's like this creepy thing my mom did on her deathbed that none of us can forget. Maybe she was hallucinating, maybe she was screwing with us. Maybe Sarah has yet to do whatever she was supposed to have done. We'll never know. Edit. People, if there was a possibility she was referencing a different Sarah, we would have already explored that thought and the story wouldn't be so creepy. But 1, Sarah is a pseudonym for another name, a much rarer one, and we only know one person with that name. And 2, she said it at the end of a conversation where we were talking about that Sarah. My cousin had brought Sarah to the hospital because he wanted my mom to meet her, or her to meet my mom, as my mom was special to him. So we asked my mom specifically what she thought of her, as she was the only one to have met her at that point. And this is what came out of it. Next story. My mother was in the hospital with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Her organs were shutting down, and everyone knew she was nearing the end of her life. She had already expressed that she was ready to go and didn't want her dying process prolonged. My sister had lived with our mother her entire life. She never moved out after college. Accepting that our mother was dying was something she simply could not do. She was determined to keep her alive for as long as possible. She wanted my mother to remain as alert as she could so she could continue to pray. As my mother's proxy, she asked that my mother receive only enough medication to slightly dull the pain without heavily sedating her. She organized prayer services in the room, anointed the room with oil, and invited people to come pray around her bed. She insisted that every possible treatment be continued to sustain my mother's life, even after the medical team recommended shifting to comfort-focused care. The day before my mother died, my mother had become mostly unresponsive. Her organs were failing. The end was near. Then, unexpectedly, my mother opened her eyes. She reached out, grabbed my sister's arm with surprising strength, and would not let go. Looking directly at her, she repeatedly said,
"Let me go. Let me go."
She kept saying those words while gripping my sister tightly. Finally, through tears, my sister said,
"I'll let you go, Mom."
Only then did my mother relax. She died a short time later. That moment has stayed with me. To me, it was as if my mother needed permission from the person who loved her most, and who had the hardest time accepting that it was time for her to go. OP, that is a very sweet interpretation of this. Realistically, I think she was suffering out of her mind and just wanted it to be done with already. Which, when you're being cared for by the bare minimum just to keep you alive, kind of makes sense. Can't lie. I don't want to bash on the whole thoughts and prayers thing too much, but gathering around her bed and praying for her is not exactly what she needs at the moment. I know that your sister was just doing what she thought was best, though, so I'm not going to judge too heavily. Next story. My dad. He begged the nurses to, please find someone to take care of my little girl. I hadn't allowed myself to cry until I heard him say it. He lost his speech that evening, but I sat with him and I noticed he was moving his hands. The priest asked what he was doing. My father worked the flight deck of many a U.S. Navy carrier, and he was leading his shipmates in for their landings. 2 days later, it poured rain loud enough that it sounded like waves crashing, and my father landed his final plane. I'd like to think it was his best buddy Jimmy, but only he knows. I haven't talked about this at any length like this before. Thanks for listening. Next story. My son didn't say anything before he died. He was only 2 weeks old, but I've always felt that for a few minutes He told us everything he needed to. Kyle was born many years ago with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Shortly after his birth, he was placed in a medically induced coma. My wife and I spent the next 2 weeks beside his bed at Duke University praying for a miracle. He was very sick. He had developed an infection in his stomach, and the doctors needed it to clear before they could operate on his heart. The night before his scheduled surgery, my wife and I were leaving the pediatric ICU. We had made it about 30 feet from his bed when suddenly we both stopped. I still can't exactly explain what we felt. It was overwhelming, and it seemed to hit us at exactly the same time. We looked at each other, then turned around and looked back at Kyle. We walked back to his bedside. For the first time in 2 weeks, his eyes were open. He was completely alert. He looked at my wife, then he looked at me. Obviously, he couldn't speak. He was a newborn. But in those few minutes, it felt as though the three of us shared an entire lifetime together. We got to see him, and he got to see us. Not through sedation or machines, but really see us. I'm a religious person, and I've always believed that moment was a gift from God. We weren't going to get a lifetime with our son, so somehow we were given a lifetime in those few minutes. A nurse noticed that he was awake and came running over. She said, "That's not supposed to happen," and increased his medication. Kyle slowly closed his eyes again. The next day, the doctors performed the surgery and placed a stent in his heart. A blood clot formed in the stent, and Kyle passed away about an hour after surgery. He never said a word, but that night, I felt like he said goodbye. Next story. My grandfather served as a signalman for the Navy in the Second World War on 2 ships that were hit. The first, the HMAS Australia, a heavy cruiser, a fortress on water, got kamikazed by the Japanese. The second, the HMAS Canberra, which during the Battle of Savo Island, while out on patrol guarding a position, was torpedoed and sunk. There is some conjecture over its sinking. The Navy story was that it was sunk by the Japanese, but it could have well been friendly fire by the Americans. Such was the scale of the conflict. After the war, he wouldn't talk of it, was strongly anti-violence and suffered post-traumatic stress right up until his death, where nurses reported he started hallucinating and crying out, "Fire! Fire everywhere! We can get out! We can get out!" Those were his last words. Next story. This is pretty different from most people's stories, but here goes. Growing up, we had 2 dogs. One was old with a number of minor health issues, but nothing too serious. The other one was young and healthy. One day, the young dog started limping. We didn't think much of it at first. We figured she just hurt herself playing in the yard. But it didn't get better. Instead, it got worse. About a week later, she was in very obvious pain, so we took her to the vet and found she had advanced bone cancer. It had started in her shoulder and spread all throughout her torso. No chance of treatment, and since she was in such bad pain, she was put to sleep that day. The older dog became despondent. She stopped playing and nearly stopped eating. At the same time, my entire family kept seeing the other dog around the house. You'd walk into a room and out of the corner of your eye, you would see her. But when you looked in that direction, she was gone. The older dog passed away a week or 2 later. The night she passed, I either woke up or had a dream that I'd woken up and saw both of them in my room looking at me, though I didn't know she had died yet. We didn't find her until the next morning. We never saw either of them again after that night. To this day, my mom insists that the younger dog was waiting for the older one to come with her. I'm not a superstitious person, but stories like this are just so... I don't know, they're so sweet, and I want to believe them, you know? It's just more, not fun, fun's not the right word, it's more fulfilling to believe them in a way. It just makes me feel good, it makes me feel hopeful, it's just really sweet, I think. Next story. This isn't disturbing, I find it actually really beautiful. My uncle, when he was dying, was unresponsive in that he wasn't waking up. He was in his last hours. They told my aunt she'd better come now, so she went to the hospital and sat down beside him and she took his hand. A minute or 2 later, he gently squeezed her hand and then he passed away. I feel he was waiting for her before he went, and he gave everything left in him to give that squeeze to say, "Goodbye, I love you." I think it's amazing that someone can know so fully that they are right about to die. I often wonder what that moment was like from his perspective, that willingness to just let go. Next story. My brother died of congestive heart failure at 31. He He was always very handy and once turned a barn/tack room into an apartment on some property he took care of. His dream before he got sick was to live off-grid in a cabin in the woods. Day before he died, he had a great day with our nephews. Ate 2 good meals. His heart and lungs were so bad they were pressing on his stomach and he usually barely ate at the end. He took a dive toward the end of his last day with us, and the hospice folks showed up. Just before he passed, his last words were, "I can see the forest." I'm convinced he found his heaven and had his cabin now. He comes back to visit us as an owl and regularly visits my folks' property where he passed. Next story. My dad died of cancer this past winter. I was his sole caretaker, and there were a few things that really stuck with me and screwed me up for a while. Still does. First, one night in the last few months of his life, he was hysterical, sobbing, repeatedly saying he doesn't want to die and that he's afraid. I grew up primarily raised by my dad, so he was always Superman to me. It shook me to my core that a man I once thought to be absolutely infallible, invincible, and the one who taught me everything about the world could be reduced to a childlike state of terror. It felt like I saw my father turn back into himself as a child. As much as I desperately tried to comfort him and tell him that things were going to be okay, I could feel the hole in my heart turn into a cavern. I didn't even believe an ounce of my own words. The other thing was the breathing. Hearing the fluid in his lungs with each breath gave me an insanely uncomfortable feeling. Every breath made me feel like I had to cough to clear my lungs. That and how thin his breaths were. In his final days, it didn't even feel like my dad was there. It felt like I was sitting with a husk. Next story. My uncle was a certified crazy veteran. He and my aunt were married late in life. Her 40s, him 60s. When she went to his house for the first time meeting, she went to sit down, and he yelled at her for getting ready to sit on Jimmy. Jimmy was his friend that lived with them, but only my uncle could see him. My aunt had to make Jimmy breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. I remember spending all day at the local VA so my uncle, Jimmy, and whoever else was in her vehicle could get their dialysis done. Jimmy was the only imaginary friend that lived with them, but my aunt sometimes had to take the other guys to their doctor's appointments or to the drive-in movie theater. About a week before he died, my aunt asked him if Jimmy wanted any eggs for breakfast. My uncle, in the most bewildered look, told her Jimmy died in Vietnam. And why in the world would she ask such a thing and bring up such a thing to upset him? My aunt, obviously at this time, had grown so accustomed to my uncle being crazy that she never really asked Jimmy's backstory. Maybe an hour before he died, he kept saying Jimmy was coming to take him home. After he died, the 2 men who carried his body out of the house were named James and Jim. I wouldn't have believed it, but I was there when they loaded him out and heard them speaking each other's names. Next story. My father was a bit stubborn and dismissed the nurses, suggesting it was time to move from the hospital to hospice care. The next day, he had realized he had made a mistake, but his pulmonary fibrosis had gotten so bad an ambulance no longer could support his move, so he was stuck. He told us he was ready to die and directed us and the staff to figure that out that day. Eventually, the staff quietly handed us the morphine button, explaining the max frequency was every 15 minutes, essentially with a wink. We spent hours dosing him into oblivion to prepare for pulling the plug on his oxygen. We decided to act when he hadn't moved in an hour. The staff can't do it, but can show us how. So I was appointed to the training and turning the equipment off. Within 30 seconds of pulling the plug, my father splashed back into reality in hysteria. It began with screaming, "Something is wrong! Something is wrong!" He was trying to stand, so my brother and I had to hold him down. After a couple minutes, it turned into "help me." The staff had come in by then, explaining that his oxygen was too low and plugging him back in would be futile. So instead of a second attempt with heavier dosing, we spent the last 5 minutes of his life holding him down through his hysterical screaming fit until he suffocated to death. My sibling, mother, and I do not speak of it. Next story. I work in healthcare, and I've never heard my patients say anything as they're about to die. Usually it's agonal breathing. However, I've heard patients say abnormal things moments before they had a cardiac arrest. The one I still think about today was this young lady who had come into my ICU for metabolic abnormalities, secondary to cancer. She was fine until she wasn't. Over the course of a few hours, this lady was becoming more hypoxic, increased respiratory rate, having difficulty maintaining adequate O2 saturation. Our plan was to intubate her. As we were gathering the medication and ventilator to intubate her, she started to panic, screaming that there is something on the wall. All the staff looked, and there was nothing there. Then she started screaming and saying, "It's coming for me, help!" And then her heart rate went flat, no pulse palpable. We did compressions on this lady for 30 minutes, unable to bring her back. Her young kids and husband were in the waiting room and were called in to be notified what had happened. Her kids were crying in agony for their mother to come back. It's a memory I never forget. Next story. I visited my grandmother the evening of her passing. She had severe dementia and was battling pneumonia after aspirating water and food due to forgetting how to swallow. The nurse had instructed me not to give her any water, and if she was thirsty, she could use a face cloth to wet her mouth. I had no idea that people could forget how to swallow, or that in this state they weren't allowed to have a cup. It was super jarring. Nana was talking a little bit, but then grabbed my hand and asked me for water. I got her the cloth and she pushed it away and said,
Please, no one will take care of me. I need water.
So I tried to explain. I couldn't. The desperation in her eyes as she began to cry and hit her hands on her legs while begging for water was so heartbreaking. I panicked and called for the nurse and my aunt, who rushed in to try and calm her, and it was too much for me to witness. She passed a few hours later. It's been 2 years this summer, and I hate that my memories of her are all still with me, but are not as prominent as begging for water in her last hours. I'm sorry, Nana. I still feel I failed you. Next story.
Bobby, come get me. I want to go home.
My great aunt was dying in her living room from liver cancer. Woman never drank a day in her life, and she suffered for months. We were all at her house, with her dying in a hospital bed in her living room. She hadn't spoken in days, and out of nowhere says,
I want to go home.
We tried our best to explain that she was home, and she sternly said,
No, tell Bobby to come get me. I want to go home.
She fell silent again and passed within the hour. Bobby was what her and her sister, my grandmother, called my grandfather. No one else did, just them. My grandfather passed 18 months before she did. Next story. Inside a trap house in southwest Baltimore, a guy who had shot up his dope was now showing signs of overdose/falling out. Others in the house scrambling to find Narcan. Others shouting and arguing, having the cliche conversation of, "Oh, we can't call 911, there's all this dope here, we're all using, they'll arrest us all." And someone else responding, "No, they can't do that anymore. They want people to call it in and not fear arrest." And then a response, "Okay, are you willing to bet on that and risk that? What if they want to know where the dope came from? What if they detain us about it? Also, aren't you on probation? We would be screwed if we called 911. Let's douse him with cold water so that he wakes up." With all of that commotion, it gets quiet because the guy on the floor who is possibly ODing starts trying to mumble something. Someone addresses him. Don't worry. You're okay. We're going to find the Narcan." There's a bit of silence, but then the dying man responds, "Do not Narcan me, please. Just let me go out feeling high. I don't want to feel anything else anymore. Let me go like this." Next story. The last words I ever heard my dad say. I'm scared. He was diabetic and had been experiencing flu-like symptoms the night before he died. EMTs diagnosed dehydration and didn't take him in. The next morning, he was still feeling strange, so we brought him in ourselves to the ER. He was walking around, acting mostly fine, so Mom and I thought it was a minor issue. When they got Dad into an ER bed, they started an IV, and within minutes, he was having severe trouble breathing. It quickly escalated to the point that the only choice the doctors had was to ventilate him. So as they were hurriedly wheeling him out of the room, we weren't allowed to go with him, he murmured quietly, "I'm scared." But he wasn't talking to either myself or my mother or even the doctors, for that matter. He was looking into thin air when he said it. Turns out Dad was in total organ failure due to sepsis. His heart was going kaput, and that's why IV fluids were backing up into his lungs. He was gone that afternoon at age 59. Way too friggin' young to die. Don't be like him, people. Take care of your health and your feet, especially if you're diabetic. Sepsis is serious and ends people very quickly. I like to think that Dad was talking to an entity that was there to comfort him and ease his transition from this life in those few seconds. Someone he could hear and see, but we couldn't. But his last words, and those last few seconds as he was taken away down that hospital hallway in fear, still disturb me, and do nothing to abate my fear of death. Next story. My uncle died in hospice a couple of years ago. The last time I saw him, a few hours before he died, he was in great pain, not quite lucid, and couldn't stop writhing. He was struggling to express himself, and I got the impression he didn't fully understand what was happening around him. I had a razor with me, which I'd brought in with the intention of shaving off the scruffy beard he'd grown on his face. I took it out, and as I used to do with him, there was a great deal of irony in the way we joked with one another. I asked him sarcastically, striking a barber's pose, "So, how would you like your beard, sir?" Amidst the groans and moans, he laughed, clearly understanding me and the joke. I like to think that he had his last laugh with me. It's not as disturbing as requested. I just took the opportunity to remember him. I don't think I can fault anyone in this thread for just wanting to share something that happened to them. This is stuff you do not get to talk about very often, so I get it. OP and all others like you get a pass for today. At least from me, I don't know if the comments will be so kind. Next story. I was working as a paramedic a few years ago, and had just come back to work after having a baby. I dropped him off with my mom, and while I was driving to work, the car in front of me crossed the center line and hit a semi head-on at highway speeds. We were in a super rural area with 30-plus minute response times for EMS, and I didn't have any equipment with me, obviously. He was in horrible shape, but alive and entrapped in the vehicle. I tried everything I could, but accepted he wasn't going to make it. I climbed in through the window and held his hands while he cried for his mama. I was only 4 months postpartum after having my only son, and hearing this grown man cry for his mom destroyed me. He passed away right as the ambulance finally got there, and I found out it was an old childhood friend, and I actually knew his mom. It ended my career as a paramedic, to be honest. I put my 2 weeks in later that day and became a stay-at-home mom, but I still think about him and his family all the time. Next story. Not words, but it was very disturbing. My stepmother-in-law was in the hospital dying from lung cancer. She wasn't speaking at this point and had been unconscious for a few days. Her daughter was obviously having a difficult time, but was focused on her mother's belongings and was openly talking about her clothes, shoes, purses, had already taken her jewelry. She had been constantly arguing with my father-in-law, and at one point my mother-in-law shot up in bed and began choking and strangling her daughter. It was traumatic and awful. I was so grateful for the hospital staff. They helped to ease mother-in-law back down peacefully. She was still pretty much unconscious. It was strange. Her daughter had also been asking for her to be given less painkillers, as she seemed to be more lucid in her brief waking periods when she had less, and the nurses had to explain that's because she was in so much pain. Next story. My mom was sick for years and eventually palliative. She had a surgery so she could pass at home. It went poorly. She was in so much pain. I've seen her through countless medical procedures, treatments, you name it, without flinching. The last day of her life, she pretty much wailed in pain. There was nothing they could do for her. At one point, she looked like she might be falling asleep. It was past visiting hours. The last thing she said to me was, "I don't want to die." Then she told me to leave. She passed that night. I knew she would pass away from her illness eventually. I just didn't think it would be so brutal. Next story. It wasn't anything he said. It was a look he gave me. A long time ago, my girlfriend's dad got pancreatic cancer. He was given 6 to 9 months to live. And sure enough, he was gone within the year. In his last month, his daughter and I came over to visit. He was sitting in his big chair, watching the TV, looking like he was on death's door. My girlfriend and I sat down on the couch and watched TV with him. He never looked away from the TV, no matter what was going on. He was focused and tuning everything else out. A commercial came on for a kitchen item you could use to cut carrots easily. My girlfriend made a joke about using it on me, if you catch my drift. Just a quick joke. I laughed somewhat hesitantly, and I looked over to her dad, and he was sitting there staring at me. He didn't have to say anything. I immediately knew what he was trying to convey to me through his eyes. "This female dog is crazy, and she will do it," is what he said to me. He would have never said that or gave me that look unless he knew he had no other chance to do so. I thought about that for years. Thankfully, all she did was cheat on me years later. I still have my wand of power. Next story. I sat with someone while he went into shock and became unresponsive when I stopped trying to help at a bad car wreck in the mountains. I had no first aid or CPR training at the time, so had no idea what to do. I just held his hand and tried to keep him talking. He wanted me to make sure his girlfriend knew how much he loves her and how sorry he was for causing the wreck. She was also in the wreck, and 2 off-duty EMTs who'd also stopped were focusing on her since she was pretty much dead and he was still talking. They were coming up around a bend, and his power steering failed, resulting in them colliding head-on with a GMC Yukon. It wasn't really his fault. He was thrown out of the windshield, and she was trapped in the car as it nearly rolled down the 25-foot steep river bank on their side of the road. The only thing that prevented the car from going in the river was an old burnt-out tree stump. As I stopped, the group of people who'd stopped first had just forced her door open to get her out. I just sat there with him and asked about his life, his girlfriend, his family, where he lives, etc., till he started hallucinating. He kept asking me where the white birds were coming from, and I think he thought I was someone else by the end. By the time an ambulance got there, which took almost 45 minutes, he was unresponsive and his girlfriend had a pulse. Not sure if he made it or not. I never got his full name and didn't see any news articles. I never got to tell his girlfriend what he said, and I still think about this a lot. Next story. Personally, my 27-year-old brother with brain mets having a moment of lucidity in hospice, long enough to say, "No, please, I just want to live," and try to get out of bed. It was the last thing he said to us before he passed 2 days later. Professionally, hospice care provider, we had a very stern German woman in her 80s who was a devout Christian. No family, no visitors, and never wanted us to stick around for company, just wanted to pray continuously. During her care every day, she would only say that she was praying today was the day God would take her home. After having her for 2 months, she broke down to me during care and looked at me crying, asking why God was keeping her alive to continue suffering and not taking her home. She asked me why God did not love her. I never heard her pray after that and refused to have the spiritual care provider visit. Watching someone go through a crisis of faith was heartbreaking. Now, I'm all for asking the big questions and philosophy and stuff like that. Deathbed, not exactly the place to be doing it. Like, this is heartbreaking. I don't want anyone, almost regardless of their worldview, to be freaking out about it when really there's bigger fish to fry. That last little bit should be in comfort, not feeling like the world has just changed in front of you. This is horrible, and I'm so sorry to hear it. Next story. I was on the phone saying goodbye to my dad, who I haven't seen in 25 years. I'm only 31. He told me finally that the reason I didn't see him was because he assaulted too many kids and fled the country. My aunt snatched the phone and apologized, said he wasn't in his right mind. He died like 10 minutes later. After Aunt hung up on me. My little sister, who I'd never met, born after he fled the country, but we were close through text and phone, took her own life a month later, leaving a note confirming everything my dad had told me. He would tell her she wasn't the first, and in her young teens had to have an abortion because it was her biological father's child. I'm still absolutely broken. I had train tickets to see her just a week after she took her life, and I had to use them for a funeral instead. I just wanted to meet my little sister and have her show me the town. I hate that man. Next story. My grandpa was diagnosed with cancer and was in the hospital in a matter of weeks. He was in the hospital, and we were prepared to bring him home on hospice the next day. He hadn't really been conscious in quite some time when he sat up in the hospital and in his normal, strong voice said, "Hello there, are we ready yet? One more day? Okay." He went right back to sleep. It was just my mom and I there at the time, so she called my aunt and we all agreed he was probably about to pass. We got him back home and set up on hospice, and he passed an hour later. I'm glad he got to die peacefully, surrounded by his family. Next story. Part disturbing, part hilarious. My beloved granddad was at a point where not much more could be done about 2 types of cancer and miscellaneous other health issues beyond 90. I was able to visit him one last time, and he was perfectly awake, lucid, and blunt, no filter as ever. There was a young man in his 20s from a more distant branch of family we seldom interacted with visiting as well. At some point, he says matter-of-factly, "I'm not sad at all. I was lucky to be able to live my life during a really great part of this country's history." After a few moments of pause, he added that, "The way things are headed, I feel sorry for you guys, though." Next story. I worked in a care home and saw a lot of elderly people die. Creepiest one for me was a lady who had been on end-of-life care for about a week, and I'd been checking on her all shift. Towards the end of my shift, I went in one last time and had this conversation with her.
"Can you make the man leave?"
"Man? What man?" She points at the empty corner.
"The man dressed in black. Please make him leave. He's scaring me."
I calmed her down as best I could and went home. When I came back the next morning, they told us in handover she'd passed away about 20 minutes after I left the day before. Next story. My mom said right before her dad died, all of her siblings started arguing about something trivial. My granddad shot up and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Will you little crap shut up? I'm busy dying here." Shortly after, my aunt gave him a dose of morphine with permission from the hospice nurse, and he died like a minute or 2 later. The ongoing joke was that she ended him. When my grandmother passed, I wasn't there, but the last thing she said to me was,
"It was nice working with you this summer. I love you so much, sweetheart. I'll see you later."
And I said, "Yeah, you will, Granny. I love you too." She fell asleep, and I left to go home. My wife had to drive. Next story. I regret seeing my estranged father before he died. It had been about 30 years and a lot of hurt and abandonment that he went off and had another family without a backward glance. But I went in and I told him I hoped he wasn't feeling badly about our situation. I had a great childhood, a good job, lovely kids, and it was a pity he never met them. Thought he might make some reciprocal comments, but he just said, "Okay," and I got out of there. He died 2 days later, and his son said he seemed lighter and happier, but I just felt annoyed, so that was that. No real closure or acceptance that he could have done better. Next story. I'm a paramedic. Went to a call for chest pain. Turned out to be the real deal. Patient actively having a serious heart attack on scene. We were doing all the paramedic things and driving fast to the hospital, and his heart rhythm changed into VFib, a lethal rhythm. It was no longer effectively pumping blood, but the body has enough oxygen for a few seconds of consciousness. We both saw his rhythm change, and he looks at the monitor, looks at me wide-eyed and goes, "But I don't see the light." And he goes unresponsive, and we do the rest of the paramedic things, and ultimately he dies in the ED at the hospital without regaining a pulse. That was heavy. I've been present at many deaths, but I still revisit this one. Next story. I've shared this before, but it's not too disturbing for me. My grandmother had dementia and saw people and kids who weren't there. She didn't know any of us, her family, including her husband of over 50 plus years. My grandfather, her husband, passed away about 5 months before my grandmother. After my grandfather passed, it was as if he was one of the people she started talking to that none of us could see. She would be in the bathroom, or when she was by herself or away from us, she would start laughing while talking with my grandfather, calling him by name. I don't believe in ghosts, but this type of stuff makes me know there is life after death. Next story. My grandfather became a shell of a man after my grandmother died. He was super unhealthy and had been on dialysis for 15 years. I'm not sure if he was actively dying in that moment, but the last time I talked to him, he told me I was a caveman, that no woman would ever love me because I was too old, and that I was the death of his family line. I was a single 30-year-old guy at the time. It seemed like in his final days he was more concerned about his legacy than anything. I was calling nearly daily at that point to cheer him up, but I stopped. I don't need to be subject to that nonsense. He died in his backyard a few weeks later. It's just so much worse when they're just not nice at the end of life. Like, you know how this ends, right? Surely you want to go out on a good note. But I guess he was just so worried that he wasn't going to get to secure that family line. I don't know. Next story. My father got to die at home in his recliner thanks to hospice nurses, as well as me and my mother making it possible. The day he fell into a drug-induced coma and passed away, he looked at me and said, "This all started when that girl of yours got me sick." He was referring to my 6-year-old daughter, whom I'd brought for a visit several months before. She had developed a cold during the visit, which of course we all caught. Mind you, he didn't seem to recall that he was actually dying of lung cancer and emphysema, the result of a 40-year-long smoking habit. He was much more comfortable with blaming an innocent child for his misery than acknowledging his own bad decisions. I won't say how I responded to him, but it was bitter and angry from a lifetime of resentment. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive him or myself for that exchange. Next story. My father and I spent the night in the hospital with my granddad, knowing his time was coming to an end. After a while, as he started to slip away, his breathing got more labored, and it was about midnight. Just like in the movies, his breathing picked up speed. He took one last big breath, and then, holy crap, that was it. He's gone. Nope, he went back to breathing normal, and this happened every 15 to 20 minutes till he finally passed at 10 o'clock that morning. It was slightly humorous at first, like he trolled us, but exhausting after a while. Also, slightly traumatizing. The scene in House of the Dragon when the king dies caused me to have a mild freakout because it sounded identical to my grandfather actually dying. Okay, super off track, but oh my god, House of the Dragon mentioned! I'm literally going to watch the finale tomorrow. It came out yesterday. I've avoided being spoiled about anything so far, and I have no idea about the book, so all I know is stuff is going to go crazy. Anyway, tangent aside, moving on. Next story. I drove an older man coworker home from work one day. It was a short drive, and he had been re-diagnosed with skin cancer a few months ago on his left cheekbone after having been without it for a year. It hit him pretty hard, and he privately told me he couldn't go through chemo/radiation therapy again. He'd rather the cancer just end him. I dropped him off. He looked me in the eyes before he got out of the car and said, "You've always been a wonderful friend to me. Thank you." I said thank you and good night. The next day he didn't come to work, and another coworker drove to his house to find he had passed in his sleep. I was the last person to see him alive, and it's haunted me ever since. Next story. My dad was always a big history buff. He and my mom spent a lot of time traveling around the United States, seeing all of the famous historical sites, particularly the Civil War. On the last night I heard my dad talk, he shared the story of Stonewall Jackson's last words. Quoting this from a site that tells the story far better than I can, Jackson had spent the afternoon of May 10th, 1863, fading in and out of consciousness, in and out of delirium, and at one point started shouting out battle orders. Then he abruptly stopped and his whole body relaxed, and a gentle smile passed over his face. "Let us cross over the river," he said calmly, "and rest under the shade of the trees." I think my dad knew how serious things were, and he broke down crying, all the while gasping because his lungs weren't working well enough to breathe. A few hours later, he got intubated and advanced to the ICU, where he stayed sedated on life support until x-rays showed acute ARDS, and then we made the decision to let him pass. Next story. Not disturbing, but when my grandmother was in hospice, she had been unable to communicate for days. Finally, on the day I was to leave for my trip, I stopped by in the morning, and she regained lucidity for a moment. She couldn't speak as she was too weak, but I was able to tell her that all of our family was there with her, and that we loved her deeply. She looked back at me and started mouthing the words, "I love you," repeatedly, until she went back to her fugue state. She died about 3 hours later. I'm really glad I was able to tell her that one last time. I love and deeply miss you, Grandma. Next story. The hospital was adamant my dad was not dying, but one day he started saying he was dying and panicking. He was in ICU delusion, but I believed him. That was a new one. The next day he was looking all around his room, following things with his eyes and looking alarmed. When the nurse asked, he said, "There are dead people here, and they're trying to take me." He was very nervous about people who would stand at the foot of his bed. He talked about them for the 3 days leading to his passing. He also saw animals fighting, specifically dogs, I believe, as well as a bird in his room. The doctors kept saying it was from his UTI, but myself and the nurses started to become alarmed and believe his every word. I was a spiritual person before my dad got sick. As he and my mom got sick, I lost a lot, if not all, of that. It was devastating, and nothing made sense. My dad never believed in anything, and suddenly at the very end of his life, he saw it and was even afraid. Now, my dad was a very stubborn man, and my theory is that he fought surrender the entire way out. I think he had the option of going peacefully when they'd come to get him, but he would not go, and things began to get much rockier. He had a good heart, but he was a very stubborn man, and I watched his soul battle with that at the end of his life. He was in full delusion, less than 100 pounds, and it was as if he was stuck in some battle in a realm that was not our own. This was nothing like his delusion prior. When he finally surrendered, he wasn't scared, but surrounded by loved ones. I was holding his hand as he breathed his last, and it was the most peaceful death I could have witnessed, which shocked me, as I had started to question if he was literally being drugged to hell. I've gotten many signs from him since his death, and believe that he found peace. But for him, I do believe it was a battle. I never imagined watching my father battle in his soul and spirit would be what gave me my definitive proof that there is more to life, but it absolutely did. He also believed he was still married to my mom on their anniversary only a couple of weeks before his death. They'd been separated for 15 years. Said, "Hey babe," to her on the day he died, with her in the room. Hugged her. It was the weirdest thing. He was always so angry toward my mother, of whom left when he cheated. His soul reconciled something with her, and with me, and he left in peace. It was the strangest thing. Next story. Combat deployments, Iraq and Afghanistan. Heard a lot of different statements, mostly calling for parents or God. Had a mate that was injured badly, and his right arm had been severed right below his shoulder. MSR Michigan was brutal after the Iranian EFPs hit the streets. So as we're focusing on controlling the bleeding and locating shrapnel entries, he asked me for his arm. Actually found it and laid it on the stretcher as he was about to be driven to the TQ. He grabbed my plate carrier and asked me to fix his arm. I just did what seemed natural and turned it, so the thumb was against his leg as it would appear naturally. He said, "Thanks, Redcoat," and I was told later he never regained consciousness. It's been 22 damn years, still one of the hard memories. I was wounded about 2 weeks later, lost partial use of my left lower leg. He had called me Redcoat for the 2 years we'd known each other. I was born in the UK, and though I barely have an accent, that wonderful bastard picked up on it, and my unusual slang. I miss his jokes. Even whilst dying, he just wanted to look squared away. Cheers. Next story. I wasn't there when my father died. No one was. I don't know his last words, but I do know his last few moments were terrifying. He had terminal lung cancer. He didn't die from wasting away. He died because a blood vessel ruptured and he suffocated or choked on his own blood. There were significant pools of blood with trails between them from his sofa to his bathroom, and then to his apartment door where he was found on the floor. He was probably very panicked as he went from room to room. Walking into his apartment was like finding a crime scene, and it gave me nightmares for months and sent me into a depressive spiral I'm still crawling my way out of. When people tell me they're a smoker, I tell them to stop. I don't tell them why, but I hope it prevents someone from seeing the things I saw. Next story. My dad was playing with his younger brother when they were kids, and they tried crawling into a culvert, and my dad got stuck. His brother, who hadn't gone in with him, ran to get help while my dad cried and thought he would be trapped forever. I think because it took so long for help to get there, the moment stuck with my dad all his life. Because even though I knew the story, it didn't seem like it was a huge deal. But in retrospect, he was always a very claustrophobic person, and I think it had a lot to do with that. When he was in the ICU dying, which I didn't realize was happening at the time, I thought he was going to get better, he suddenly looked past my family and said, "I feel like I'm trapped in that culvert again, and I can't get out. I'm scared." We spent a few minutes comforting him, thinking he was just having a panic attack. Finally, he calmed down and said, "It's okay now. I can see the light at the end of the culvert. I know I can get out now." His eyes rolled back into his head, and he coded. Next story. My grandma had dementia and cancer, and was perfectly fine before my grandpa, her husband, died. They were perfect, and she deteriorated quickly within the year after his passing. She got put on hospice within the year at her own house in the bedroom downstairs. Previously, her mother owned the house, my great-grandma, and she also passed away on hospice on that same bed in that same room in the same spot. Before my grandma passed, she hadn't been able to speak a clear sentence in days, let alone be awake. She awoke and pointed at the corner of her room and said her mother's name and that she was here. My great-grandmother pointed in the same corner saying her mother's name and calling her an angel while she was on hospice in the same room. My grandma did not know what happened, to my knowledge. My grandma called out to her and pointed and said how beautiful she was, what an angel she was, and also called to another family member who was very close to her mother before she passed. She kept speaking in the corner of the room and pointing, saying, "Look, she's here. My angel is here," and how happy she was to see her. Rest in peace. Next story. Not verbal, but on my last year of pharmacy school, on my first internal medicine block, I was standing with my preceptor and one of the pharmacy residents. We were close to a patient's room, and I had followed the patient for a few days. He was a dad, had a long history of alcoholism, and was not doing well. I think he was admitted for SBP and hepatic encephalopathy, but I don't remember 100%. He was on BiPAP, and the family was in his room arguing with each other in front of him about who should get what after he dies. "No, you shouldn't get that because you didn't do XYZ. That kind of thing. Just awful, bitter, miserable stuff. No peace and support for him or sharing stories to reminisce on better times. Anyway, I glanced over towards his room, wondering if things had gotten any better for him, and he glanced back at me, and the look just broke me. It was a look of pain, regret, sadness, but more than anything, he just looked exhausted. I felt like I'd been stabbed in the gut when we locked eyes, and I had to look away because I felt so sick as I overheard his family's loud argument even outside the room. A few days later, after deciding to write my care plan on his case, I went to his chart for an update, only to face a pop-up saying, "This patient is deceased. Do you still want to view the chart?" I didn't know the man in life. Not really. He could have been a horrible dad and partner, so I'm not necessarily condemning his family not coming together after decades of bad behavior and abuse to sing Kumbaya around him as he died, if it was the case, but the fact that nobody could find the common decency to at least give him peace to rest and instead choosing to argue and fight right in front of him, it just made me sad. It has always stuck with me. I can't really even articulate what I learned. I guess just to surround myself in life with those who are here for me as I am now instead of what I might offer them in death. I don't know. Next story. My grandpa had a super rare and aggressive form of Alzheimer's. It was pretty messy and complicated. My dad loved the other side of the country and neglected to tell me for 2 years of my grandpa's condition, but I would see him weekly and notice it. When I raised my concerns, my dad dismisses it as old age, and my auntie, the sensible one, wasn't much help either, but I later found out she didn't want to get in the way with how my dad was dealing with it. I found out officially during his funeral. I still haven't forgiven my dad for that. During the late stages, he was taken to hospital for complication, and we were all told he might not make the night, so we all went up to see him. I was the last one to leave. As I gave a speech to him about how I was okay, He got me to uni, and our share of history will always be something I cherished. As I was about to leave, he tapped me, removed his breathing mask, and said, "Always knew you would. Never give up, never surrender. You're going to do great." He died a few days later. Thanks, Grandpa. I love you. I miss you. I hope you and Grandma are reunited. Next story. The most disturbing moment for me was responding to someone who lived alone and had fallen down a long flight of stairs onto the basement floor, laying there alone in a pool of their own blood and waste for probably 5 days. The mail carrier every day stepping up on her porch only feet above, oblivious to her broken body, stuck to the floor by the time we were notified and arrived. The person looked up at me, unable to speak, but with the truest look of horror I've yet seen in human eyes. They knew they were about to die and appeared to be begging for it not to happen. They died in the med-flight helicopter minutes later, but they didn't die alone. That experience has stuck with me ever since. Next story. I work at a memory care. A husband and wife lived there. The wife had dementia and was agitated often. The husband had cancer but no dementia. The wife had passed away suddenly while she was walking. The husband would say these words for as long as I knew him. "I just want to make it one more day than she does." After she passed, he stopped taking his meds and he was gone in a couple of days. I've got a list of residents I've seen pass. It's at 70 people now. I was the last person several of them ever spoke to, and I've actually been in the room when they pass. The last words one of them said was, "Am I going to die?" I said, "No, you're going to be okay." And their last words were just, "Thank you." Another lady with profound dementia suddenly remembered things that she wouldn't have remembered otherwise, like her husband passed, her parents' names, our names and children. One of us told her, "Hi, name. It's our name." Then she gasped and reached her hands up, and she was gone right then and there. The most disturbing one was a man who kept repeating, "Oh God, no. Oh God, no, please." I hope it doesn't come off in bad faith when I do voices for stuff like that. Really, my goal is to just make it more immersive, not to disrespect anyone's memories or state of being or whatever. I'm interested to hear what you guys think about it. If you think it's too much, please let me know. I don't want to be a jerk here, but I am doing my best just to bring life to the story. That's my goal with it. Next story. 2 experiences come to mind. 1. Before my grandmother died, she had a surgery that she didn't expect to survive. She had suffered for about 25 years with a debilitating autoimmune disease. Before this surgery, she had made her peace and she was ready. But she survived the surgery and she was angry she did. She threw a plastic water pitcher across her hospital room. She hissed at a nurse. She glared at everyone. She wouldn't talk to her family. When I went to see her the day after her surgery, she wouldn't look at me. When I said, "I love you," she replied in a biting tone,
"Then let me go."
That's all she said. Right then, I prayed that God's will be done and that she would find everlasting peace. She died the next day. Next story. My mom was dying of cancer and saying a lot of things that didn't make sense. She would get really agitated if we interrupted her because it took a lot of energy for her to speak. She was laying on her hospice bed, looked at me and said,
"I have to tell you something."
I said, "Okay, Mom." And she started telling me a story of when she was a medic in the war. Except she wasn't a medic. I never fought in a war and never left the country. I just let her speak, and she went on for a long time, at least 30 minutes of looking at me and talking about the war. When she was done, she fell right asleep. My dad cleared his throat and said, She just told you the entire series finale of MASH? I didn't even know that she watched that show, but she just explained everything that happened in the last episode. Next story. When my wife's grandmother was at the last stages of her battle with dementia, she stopped talking and eating, as people do. She hadn't spoken in months. Her grandmother had been her primary caregiver when my wife was little, and her wisdom guided us both much in life. I hadn't visited in the past few months as her granddaughter and I were nearing a divorce. When I walked in, she opened her eyes and beckoned me closer. She whispered, "Hello," and I started to cry. She took my hands and then knotted her hands together and said, "Together, you two." She stared at me for about 5 minutes and drifted off. My wife was watching from the corner of the room. She hadn't heard her grandmother speak in months. My wife and I both cried. We left and she died later that night. we've stayed together. We fell back in love. Next story. My grandma was such a sweet person, always putting everyone else's needs before her own. She had a stroke and couldn't live by herself anymore. My granddad had died years before, so we had to put her in a home. As she slowly declined, she would tell my mom that Cliff, my granddad, kept asking her to go with him. My mom, who sort of operates on the maturity of a 13-year-old due to past trauma, would tell her she couldn't leave yet because we all needed her. Time went on and my grandma kept having strokes until it got to the point that the doctor called and said my grandma was having 100 strokes per minute. That's not a typo. So the doctor scheduled a meeting with my mom and her siblings for the following day to figure out a treatment plan moving forward. Well, my grandma must have decided that she didn't want to cause that much trouble for everyone because she passed away that night. I like to think my granddad came to ask her to come with him again. And she finally said yes. Next story. I worked in nursing homes for like 15 years, and I saw a few disturbing deaths. The one that really comes to mind is a guy who had a psychotic episode prior to death, and he kept insisting they were coming for him. Since I was the big guy from therapy, they kept calling me in to help reposition him and keep him comfortable. I witnessed some pretty freaky crap. He was for sure having hallucinations and was trying to evade whatever he was seeing. When asked to describe what he was seeing, he said their eyes were red. He couldn't make out exactly how they looked, but just that they were dark figures. His screams still haunt me. He passed not long after he came, and it was as traumatic as you'd expect. I never got the full report, but he broke out of his mittens and clawed his eyes. The nurse later told me that he was screaming about them being in his brain, and he tried to get to his brain through his ears and eyes. He ultimately broke free from his passive restraints and smashed his head repeatedly until it was over. Very unfortunate case that's not very common, but more common than you'd think. Glad I don't work in that setting anymore. Screw that crap. I can imagine that working surrounded by people who are in crises like these could just warp your view of reality. Everything would just become so much more, dreary. It's hard to stay optimistic, I guess, when you're surrounded by reminders that this is what can happen if your mind suddenly decides to break. Horrifying. Next story. My mom, who passed last year just after her 61st birthday from cancer, had one final, full-on conversation with me. At the end of visiting, she stood, hugged me as I left her hospital room. We didn't realize we were so close to the end at that stage, and when I said I loved her, she asked if I really meant it. Of course I do, Mom.
I love you too, son.
She never regained consciousness after that night. She passed a week later after we'd managed to get her home to pass with us. The previous day, she told my auntie that her mom, my Nana, had come to see her, told her that was the end, and that she'd be waiting for her. My aunt told me that afterwards, and I genuinely believe that she needed to have that last conversation with me and that last declaration of love so she could pass. My aunt is also adamant my mom was clear and with it when she spoke about her mom waiting for her. Next story. My grandfather was on hospice, dying of lung cancer. It was the final hours, and they had given him a boatload of morphine, and he was mostly in and out of consciousness, mostly became unresponsive or just mumbled things unintelligibly. Then he sat straight up and said as clear as ever, "I forgot to give that red book." Then he lay back down and never said anything coherent again. The only red book we could find in his apartment was a very old translated copy of the Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam with all the cool lithographs as illustrations. The creepy thing was, the week before this I'd been traveling and went in to see an art museum. On temporary exhibit were all the original lithographs of the Rubaiyat. I'd really enjoyed it, but I hadn't told anyone about it at all. Before that, the number of times the Rubaiyat had come up in casual conversation with anyone in my family was precisely 0. I don't know if this thread was as disturbing as I would have expected it to be, given the question, but it definitely wasn't an easy one to get through. So, I hope out there you're all taking care of yourselves. Don't let the heavy thoughts get too heavy now. For now, though, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.